Hi everyone, I just wanted to make a video because there's some other things that I've been noticing about this Super Bowl logo, and I'm not sure if anyone else has noticed this or not, but I think there's some very important symbolism in here that I wanted to talk about. But first I just want to say that I think it's great that the Eagles won the Super Bowl, because of course that would represent the Church of Philadelphia and how the woman flies with the wings of an eagle. So I think that's a good sign for those who are in the ARK. And of course the stadium was shaped like an ARK, as I showed in my last video. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this symbolism because there's something else that I noticed about this. Okay, what I noticed is that this middle piece, the trophy over here, is actually shaped like the One World Freedom Tower, and then you have the eye over here, which is shaped like the Twin Towers, and then of course you have this capstone over here that looks like the capstone being placed at the top of the tower. And of course this also looks like the consummation of the covenant, which I've talked about in other videos. But of course there's always a true and a false, so that there would be Satan's representation of what he's trying to do with the One World Freedom Tower and the Twin Towers, but there's also the true representation that's in the Bible when Jesus confirms the covenant that I've talked about before. And of course the way Satan is going to do that is through the mark of the beast, which I can talk a little bit more about later. But I just wanted to point this out, that this looks like the Twin Towers. And then the other thing that I noticed is that you have the L on this side, which of course the L represents 50 in Latin numerology. And so this would be 50, which would represent the Jubilee, and then they're representing the capstone being placed on the pyramid, and then the two columns here, which would represent the two DNA strands. And so I was curious to see when they first came up with this trophy, and so I put in when was the Super Bowl trophy designed, and it's showing over here that it was first presented in January of 1967. So of course that would be exactly one Jubilee. So it seems as though this was all planned, and that Satan, of course, if we know that 2017 is a Jubilee year, then of course Satan would know that as well, that 2017 is a Jubilee year, and so that would explain the movie Oblivion and why they show 2017 as being the last Super Bowl, which I believe was this past Super Bowl was the 2017 Super Bowl. Okay, so I want to quickly go over a couple of Super Bowl tables that I did last year, because I think this is even more significant this year. But there was two matrices that came up. The first one was in Leviticus 4:27. It's interesting that you have 27 here, which would be 711, just as in Luke 17:27 it talks about Noah's Ark, as I showed in my last video. And so I believe the 27 can be interpreted as 117. But you see that you have the word Super Bowl came up over here, and as I mentioned last year when I did these tables, this over here is about the sacrifice, the atonement sacrifice. But when you go to the next match, it comes up in 1 Samuel 6, which I've talked about before, and this is when I noticed that this representation over here was the exact same imagery as what's in Zechariah 14, and it represents a capstone being placed on the mountain or the pyramid or the temple. But of course this would be God's temple that it's talking about here, and Jesus would be the stone that it's talking about. But if you look at 1 Samuel 6:11, it says, and they put the ark of Jehovah, of course the stadium was shaped like an ark, upon the cart, and the coffer with the mice of gold and the images of their tumors. And the kine took the straight way to the way of Beth Shemesh, and they went along to the highway, lo, and as they went, and turned not aside to the right hand or to the left. And the lords of the Philistines went after them unto the border of Beth Shemesh. Okay, but if you keep reading, it says, and they of Beth Shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley, and they lifted up their eyes and saw the ark, and rejoiced to see it. And the cart came into the field of Joshua, a Bethshemite, and stood there, and there was a great stone. Of course, the great stone would be Jesus. He would be the capstone. And they clave the wood of the cart, so it's going to cleave just like the Mount of Olives is going to cleave when Jesus steps foot on the mountain in Zechariah 14. And I've talked about how the number 14 represents the cleaving or the division that's going to take place. And this is all a representation of DNA. And then, of course, the Ark of the Covenant is a representation of DNA. I've talked about that before. And so the Ark was placed on the wood on the cart, and then they clave the wood of the cart and offered the kine a burnt offering unto the Lord. And when I had first done this table last year, I didn't know what milch kine meant when I was reading the Matrix, but then I realized later that milch kine are milking cows, and so I realized that represents the two witnesses, the two kine, the two cows that give milk that were leading the cart. So they represent the two witnesses. And so this is all a representation, the same imagery as what's in Zechariah 14, and I've talked about that before. Okay, so what I hadn't tried before is putting in the words last Super Bowl, and when you put in the word last, it actually comes up with 4 matches. And so the first match would be Leviticus 27, and then the second match is 1 Samuel 6, and then I believe the third one is also 1 Samuel 6. And then when you get to the fourth match, there's an additional matrix that comes up, and this one comes up in 1 Corinthians 10. And what's interesting is if you look at, it goes through to verse 23, but if you look at verse 17, you see that it says, seeing that we who are many are one bread and one body, for we are all partakers, or we all partake of one bread. And so this would be a parallel to John 17, where Jesus said, okay, I'll just pull this image up over here, but Jesus basically said that we are one, and that's interesting. That was in John 17:11, so that was verse 11, where Jesus said that, this is another verse, it says that the glory that you have given me, I have given them, to them, that they may be one, even as we are one. And of course 22 would represent DNA, but it's in verse 11 that Jesus said, and now I am no more in the world, but these are in the world, and I am come to thee, Holy Father, to keep through thine own name those whom thou hast given me, that they may be one as we are. So this is where Jesus said that we are all one in John 17, and especially in verse 11, and then of course he said it again in verse 22, because this is all ultimately about DNA. That's what's represented by the twin towers. Of course, Satan wants everyone to be one with him, and God wants everyone to be one with him. So this is all ultimately about DNA. And so over here in 10 Corinthians 17, if you leave out the 0, because 0 really has no value, you would have the 117 right here. And of course, if you turn the LII upside down, it makes a 117. So it's pretty easy to see how that would make the numbers 117. Okay, so now I just want to show you how the tables seem to confirm that the number 27 seems to be synonymous with the number 117, and that it seems to represent the Hebrew year 777, because the very first line that comes up is 777 years. And then when you get to the bottom of this matrix, it mentions 120 years, which would seem to be a parallel to the 120 Jubilees that would make up the 6,000 years, and this is coming up in Genesis 6. Okay, so this is how long God said that he would strive with man, 120 years, and then when you get to Genesis 7:11, it talks about the 600 years of Noah's life, which would represent the 6,000 years. The second month would seem to represent the second millennium, and the 17th day of the month would seem to represent the year 2017, or at least that's what God told Pastor Sandy Armstrong that all of this represents, and that's why he's been talking about the year 2017. And you see this comes up in Genesis 7:11. Okay, so I just want to point out a couple of more things, because it's really interesting how some of these images came up. I put in LII Super Bowl Eagles win, and over here in this image you see the number 11 prominently displayed in the front, and then you have a 1-9, but you can barely see the 1 over there, so it's like it's making 119 or 911. And then over here you have 52 and 17. Of course, the 17 is obvious, and then this would be Super Bowl 52, but the 5 and the 2 adds up to 7, as I mentioned in the video where I talked about the Jubilees and how it was coming up in Leviticus 25, which adds up to 7, and Jeremiah 34, which adds up to 7, and then it was in Isaiah 61 where God proclaims the acceptable year of the Lord, and that adds up to 7. And then, of course, it was in Leviticus 27:17 where it mentions the year of Jubilee as well. So all those seem to represent the year of Jubilee. And then you had the same numbers coming up in some of these other images. Over here you have 86 and 17. And so that would be 14, which is 7 plus 7, and it's in 1 Samuel 6:14 where the cart is, the stone cleaves the cart that the Ark of the Covenant is on, which represents Jesus coming back and the restoration of the DNA, which is the same thing that's represented in Zechariah 14. So this adds up to 14. And then over here you have 17. And then again you have 9 over here. And over here you have 11. Over here you have 56, which adds up to 11. So it's really interesting, some of the images that came up, how they seem to represent all of this as well. And then you had 86 featured in this picture over here, which again equals 14. 41 is 14 backwards, and of course the number 14 represents the 144,000, which would be the Church of Philadelphia that's given the wings of an eagle. So hopefully this is all a sign that we fly soon. Thanks for watching, and God bless you.